All right, so we're gonna look at the dermis. And as we mentioned before, because the dermis is supplying the epidermal layer with nutrients, it is richly vascularized, so lots of blood vessels here, and it is richly innervated. Okay. Now there are two distinct layers of the dermis. There's the papillary dermis, which includes the dermal papillae. All right, we'll talk about what that is. That's going to be contributing to your fingerprint. And then there is the reticular layer, which is the underlying layer of the dermis. And that is the majority of the thickness of the dermis. It's 80%, whereas the papillary layer is much smaller. Okay, and I'll point those out here. So we have that thicker reticular dermis and the very small papillary dermis. So that layer is significant in the formation of fingerprints. Now the reticular dermis is where all of the, again, magic is happening. That reticular means network. So we have all of the blood vessels here, the nerves here, and the follicles, hair follicles and roots and things like that. Okay, so the papillary dermis has some dermal papillae, and dermal papillae are essentially the finger-like projections. So these finger-like projections, again, so this is your epidermis, this is your dermis. This small layer here would be your papillary layer. This deeper layer is your reticular layer, and specifically in the papillary layer are these projections, which are called dermal papillae. Okay? And these basically increase the surface area across which nutrients can move up into the epidermis. Right? So again, that infolding of this layer, that infolding increases the surface area. And we want to increase the surface area so we can get more nutrients moving across this surface. Now, the dermal papillae, only in the palms and the soles here, the dermal papillae sit on a ridge, which is called the dermal ridge, okay? Only in the palms and the soles. And because of this ridge, it's gonna project upward into the epidermis and create an epidermal ridge. So it's like we have a bump or a groove in the dermis that is gonna project up into the epidermis, and that's gonna form an epidermal ridge, also called a friction ridge. And these are the grooves that we see if we look very closely at our hands, at the palm of your hands and the soles of your feet. Okay? And these form your fingerprints. If you look very closely, you can see them. And this is the layer where they are initiated, where they're formed. Question? Your fingertips? Yep, it's unique to each person. It would, yep, because all you're damaging is the epidermis, whereas that print is being formed deep in the dermis. So when you regenerate that epidermal tissue, you end up with the same fingerprint. That's why it's unique to everyone and it does not change. Okay. Any other questions? I see a hand. No? Okay. Now the fingerprints are also going to give the skin some grip, or give the hands some grip, right? And they're gonna allow us to hold onto surfaces a little bit easier than if we didn't have them. Well, of course, we don't know what it would be like because we do have them, right? So they allow us to grip surfaces a little bit better. Okay, now we're gonna go a little bit deeper into the reticular layer of the dermis. Questions? Mm-hmm.
Besides grip, is there another advantage of like papillae? Like, it's like an increased surface area, so like, would that have anything to do, like, as a benefit with it, besides like the
Not really. So the reason it does that is just to increase the surface area across which nutrients can move. But specifically in the palms and the soles, we see these ridges, those friction ridges. Okay. Any other questions? Okay, so the reticular dermis is, again, the thicker part of the dermis, and the major feature that we're gonna see here is collagen fibers, So lots of collagen to give the skin that tensile strength again, and a little bit of flexibility as well. Now there's an area where the collagen fibers are separated. Okay, so you have lots of collagen fibers, and there's a groove where they can be separated, and that creates a cleavage line. A cleavage line. And I'll show you what that looks like in a minute. Okay. Now we also have the formation of flexure lines. So flexure lines, we can see them in the hands and the feet, at the wrist, at the elbows, at the knees. Those are those demarcations of continuous folding. So the continuous bending of fingers across joints is what produces flexure lines. Okay. Now also in the reticular dermis is rich blood supply. So there are two vascular plexuses here. And when we say vascular plexus, it's a network of capillaries that are coming together to form a plexus. The dermal plexus is going to be located between the hypodermis and the dermis. Right? Between the hypodermis and the dermis, and the function of the dermal plexus is to give blood supply to the dermis and question?
So you're talking about this indication blood, the slides indicating nerves. Is this two different structures?
So the blood vessels aren't seen here. They're not seen here, but this is just giving you some context as to the layers.
Right, so on the left there, though, the dermal plexus and subpapillary plexus. Is this different? Is that a different structure than what you're talking about?
No, this is what I'm talking about. The dermal plexus and the subpapillary plexus.
Okay.
So we said that it had rich nerve supply, but it also has rich blood supply. Okay, any other questions? Okay, so the dermal plexus we said was between the hypodermis and dermis, and it's going to give blood supply to those structures, to the hypodermis and to the dermis. Okay. Whereas the subpapillary plexus was going to be located in the papillary layer, just beneath the papillary layer, and that is going to supply the upper epidermis. I'll say that again. The dermal plexus was located between the hypodermis and the dermis. Do we have questions in the back? No? Okay. Whereas the subpapillary plexus, it's still in the reticular layer, but it's just beneath the papillary layer. And that's going to supply the papillary layer and the upper epidermis. So that's the layer that really goes and feeds the epidermal layer, or the epithelial layer above. All right. And again, these are the vessels that are important in regulating the temperature. Okay, so first off, we have those friction ridges that we saw in the fingers and the soles of the feet. Now, in between the friction ridges are some small openings of sweat glands, right? So the small openings of these sweat glands, this is going to be the reason why when you touch something, you automatically leave a fingerprint, okay? Because when you touch it, there's sweat seeping out of each of those tiny glands that are sort of outlining the shape of your fingerprint. Okay, so regardless of how clean you wipe your hands, every time you touch something, you leave a fingerprint. And then the second image here is actually showing those cleavage lines, right? They're running up and down in the hands and the legs. They're running across in the thorax and abdomen, and they're more circular in the head and neck region, those cleavage lines. And they're not very apparent to the gross eye, but they are important, especially to surgeons. It's going to be very important to cut along these lines. Okay, if we don't cut along these lines, you have an increased chance of gaping of a wound, and you decrease the chance of that wound healing as nicely as if you did cut along those lines. So before we properly understood this, surgeons used to do a vertical incision for C-sections and other types of abdominal surgery. And now we understand that. We go across, so we want to go parallel to those lines. And then lastly were the flexure lines. And again, these were just areas that are continuously folding. So across joints, across fingers, across the wrist, so on and so forth. All right, next we'll talk about the hypodermis. So the hypodermis is also called the superficial fascia. The main contents here are fat and areolar tissue. Areolar tissue is another way of saying loose connective tissue. All right, and those are the two structures that we're going to find here. The function of this layer is to insulate the body as well as anchor the upper skin to the underlying tissues, mainly muscle. Okay, and it's going to have a different distribution in males versus females. So this layer is the layer that thickens when we put on weight, and that is going to differ between males and females. Males are going to have abdominal deposition of the hypodermis. Females are going to have deposition in the breasts and the thighs. Okay, so this layer differs from male to female. All right, we'll talk about the 3 pigments that give skin its color. The most important is melanin, and it's made from a molecule called tyrosine. Okay, and again, it's made by melanocytes, but it's going to be deposited onto a keratinocyte, and it's going to shield the keratinocyte from the UV radiation. Okay. Now, this is why when you're exposed to sun, your melanocytes are going to ramp up, they're going to create more melanin, and you get darker. Because melanin is produced in a response to sunlight to shield those keratinocytes from that UV radiation. Now, the color of skin varies not because of the amount of melanocytes. We all have the same amount of melanocytes. The amount of pigment or the amount of melanin that is secreted, as well as the type of melanin, varies from person to person. So there's several types of melanin. There's a yellow hue, a red hue, a darker hue. Okay? Next, we're going to talk about carotene. And carotene is a yellowish pigment found in tomatoes, carrots, right, pumpkin. And that can be deposited onto the skin, sometimes seen in the cornea or on the skin itself, and it's going to give the skin a yellowish hue. So if you eat lots of those types of foods, you can start to turn yellow. Okay? And lastly, there was hemoglobin, all right, also seen under the skin, specifically for paler complexions. All right, and that's because we can actually see the pinkish hue of the blood showing through that skin. All right, so these are the 3 pigments that can contribute to the color of skin. All right, so we are going to wrap up by talking about the sebaceous glands and the sweat glands. So sebaceous glands occur all over the body except for the palms and the soles. So everywhere across your body, your hair, right, your scalp, you have sebaceous glands. And these glands are going to secrete sebum. And sebum is an oily substance that really moisturizes the skin. It's like the body's natural moisturizer. Okay? And the word sebum actually means animal fat. Okay, so it's a very oily substance, and it's really deposited onto the hair follicle. So it's deposited onto the hair follicle, it moves its way down, and then it's deposited onto the skin. Okay, that's what's deposited at your hair roots, and that's your body's way of moisturizing itself. It's also important for collecting dirt, right, and lubricating the skin. Then one thing we forgot to mention here is the mechanism of secretion. So the mechanism of secretion is going to be holocrine secretion. So that's something we saw already, where the entire cell ruptured or lysed to release this secretion. Your sweat glands. So the sweat glands, also called the sudiferous glands, right? They're widely distributed throughout the body. We have 2 different types, which we're going to talk about shortly, and they secrete sweat. And remember, we said sweat was a way for the body to not only lose heat, but to excrete some of its waste products. 99% of sweat is going to be water, right? So most of sweat is water, and then we're going to have a small contributing factor coming from urea and other waste products, as well as some ions. Okay. So the 2 types of sweat glands were eccrine glands, and eccrine are the most common, most numerous throughout the body. They're going to produce what's known as normal sweat. Okay, so there are 2 types of sweat we're going to talk about in a minute. Eccrine glands are the most numerous, particularly numerous along the forehead. Okay, that's your normal or true sweat. And the mechanism of secretion here is merocrine secretion. What was merocrine secretion? What was merocrine secretion? That was just exocytosis, right? The cell did not rupture or lyse in any way. Those contents were just exocytosed. All right, then we had apocrine sweat glands, and apocrine sweat glands, as the name implies, their mechanism of secretion is going to be apocrine secretion, where just the apical part lyses off, and they're going to be confined to the axilla, right, the armpits, the groin region, and the anal region, so the genital areas. Okay, and they're gonna produce a different type of sweat. This is your musky odor sweat. Okay, this is your body odor. All right, and that is going to be important as a pheromone. So there's a lot of research which suggests that the type of body odor you give off determines the type of mate that you will attract. Okay, and it also has some very important association with your immune system. And research also suggests that persons who are attracted to each other, right, physically and sexually, have similar immune systems. And that's what the mate or the other person will pick up in your body odor. Okay? This is very well understood in animals, not so much for humans. And lastly, we're going to talk about two modifications of these apocrine glands. That's your mammary glands, which are modified apocrine glands, and they secrete milk, right? They lactate, as well as your ceruminous glands. Your ceruminous glands, which are found in the inner ear, and their secretion is earwax. Okay, so both of these glands are essentially modified apocrine glands.